Hello everyone, I'm Megan Sullivan and welcome to History in Games, the audio and video series where I play historical fiction games and talk about the real history hidden inside these wonderful games. Today I'm wrapping up my first full playthrough of Civilization VII, which involves guiding the ancient Egyptian pharaoh Hatshepsut through the modern age. The modern age includes new civics like globalism and political theory, new technologies like combustion and electricity, new social policies like free speech and sphere of influence, etc., etc. So, how is Hatshepsut's experience with the modern age? Well, we'll get to that. But first, today's lesson. So in order to navigate the modern age, I decided to pair Hatshepsut with the Mughal Empire, which in Civ VII mostly focuses on gold and military, which kind of fit my pivot towards trade, sort of. But that left me with a history-based challenge. How could I connect the Mughals, whose empire lasted from the 16th to the 19th century, to the Egyptians, who at that point were under the rule of the Ottoman Empire? I mean, outside of trade, these countries didn't have a whole lot of direct influence on each other. More to the point, how could I tie Hatshepsut, who ruled Egypt in the early 14th century BCE, to the Mughals of the early modern age? Was there anything I could use? Some relic of the past that still existed? Actually, there is. In a completely unrelated bit of research, I learned that Coptic, which represents the very last stage of the ancient Egyptian language, was still being spoken in small pockets of Upper Egypt as late as the 18th century. So not only were people still speaking ancient Egyptian during the time of the Mughal Empire, they were technically speaking the language well into the modern age. And in fact, it's still around in the form of Coptic church hymns and writing. But if Coptic is the native language of the Egyptians, then why did it die out? And why does its writing system use Greek letters instead of hieroglyphs? Yeah, no, those cool-looking pictograms you see on the walls of ancient Egyptian temples? To answer all of these questions, we need to do a brief history lesson on the Egyptian language itself, which I'm excited about because it's really interesting. The Egyptian language is one of the longest documented languages in all of history. Because of this, linguists have divided the Egyptian language into 6 major stages. The first is Archaic Egyptian, which was spoken before 2600 BCE. This is what Egyptians would have spoken in the early dynastic period, during the reigns of Egypt's earliest pharaohs. Next comes Old Egyptian. This was spoken from about 2600 BCE until 2000 BCE. This was the language of the era of the Old Kingdom, and about the time when Egyptian hieroglyphs, which we'll talk about in just a moment, came into their own. This was a really cool time in Egyptian history, by the way, because this period includes the Age of Pyramids, when pharaohs like Djoser and Khufu were building monumental structures to the gods and to themselves, and they were doing so while speaking Old Egyptian. Then we get to Middle Egyptian, or Classical Egyptian, which was spoken from 2000 until 1350 BCE, and this is where things get interesting, because Hatshepsut ruled at the start of the 15th century BCE and would have been one of the last speakers of Middle Egyptian before the language transitioned into Late Egyptian. Late Egyptian lasted from the Late Bronze Age until the 7th century BCE, when it was replaced with what scholars call Demotic Egyptian. Demotic Egyptian was the vernacular, or everyday language of the Egyptians, that was spoken and written down for the next several hundred years. But then, for reasons we'll cover later, it too gave way to Coptic. This was the official language of the Christian church in Egypt, which started to flourish in the 3rd century CE. Coptic is a mix of Greek and Egyptian words and preserves the phonetic sounds of Egyptian and uses mostly Egyptian grammar, which qualifies it as being a direct descendant of the language Hatshepsut used during her lifetime. But it too started to die out as early as the 7th century after the Arab conquest of Egypt, which raises the question, if ancient Egyptian is a dormant language, how do we know what ancient Egyptian sounded like? How can we be sure? Because they left plenty of clues in their writing. The Egyptians started writing their language down around 3200 BCE, and they used what we call hieroglyphic script to do so. The word hieroglyph isn't Egyptian, by the way. It actually comes from the Greek words sacred carving and was first used by the 5th century BCE historian Herodotus in his major work, The Histories. The Egyptians themselves called their writing system something like Menu Neger, or the words of the gods. And the reason they did so was because they believed that the gods, specifically their god Thoth, invented writing, which, by the way, is why writing was taught in temples. How do scholars know how to read hieroglyphs, though? Come to think of it, how do we know how to pronounce the words written in it? Well, Egyptologists have a pretty good idea of how to read and pronounce hieroglyphs, and thus ancient Egyptian, thanks to a variety of sources. The first and most famous is the Rosetta Stone, a 2nd century BCE trilingual text document written in Greek, Aramaic, and Egyptian hieroglyphs that was first decoded by Jean-François Champollion in the 19th century. Egyptologists also rely on a number of classical works, as well as some Mesopotamian texts, that transliterated a number of Egyptian words. They also study Coptic, which, as I mentioned before, preserves a lot of Egyptian words spelled out phonetically in Greek letters, and finally, Egyptologists look to related Afro-Asiatic languages to fill in the blanks, because Egyptian is a distinct branch of the Afro-Asiatic family. Using these handy tools, Egyptologists have unlocked a lot of secrets about Egypt's sacred writing system and the language it's meant to convey. And one of the coolest things they learned is how the Egyptians went about reading hieroglyphs. You see, in spite of how they look, hieroglyphs aren't just pretty pictures. They're actually composed of 3 basic types of signs: logograms representing words, phonograms representing sounds, and determinatives placed at the end of the word to help clarify its meaning. So for example, the hieroglyph for sun could, just have the meaning of sun. Or if it's at the end of a word, it's letting the viewer know that the word they just read has something to do with the sun, so sunlight or sunrise. Or the hieroglyph represents a sound or multiple sounds to help you sound out a word. So if I were to draw a sun sign and follow that with a picture of a fish, you could sound out the word sunfish, which is a type of fish. And what's great is that by using this same system, you can represent words that have a much more abstract meaning. So if I drew a picture of a bee and then a leaf, you could sound out the word bee leaf in English. These are just some silly examples, but it gives you a better idea of how to read ancient Egyptian. Oh, by the way, there is a fancy term for this linguistic concept of using pictograms to represent sounds in order to create a word, and it's called the rebus principle. Another fun fact about hieroglyphs is that they can be read from left to right to left, and top to bottom. And the way you know which way to read them is to look at the direction the hieroglyphs are facing. If they're all facing right, you want to start reading from the right side. If they're facing left, then you want to start on the left side. However, occasionally the Egyptians like to throw a curveball. For example, if an important god or pharaoh was represented on a tomb or a temple wall, whichever way that important figure was facing, the hieroglyphs might be facing the same way. Not only does this look aesthetically more pleasing, but also it ensures the reader will start reading on the side closest to the figure being represented, which emphasizes their importance in the text that follows. This is what scholars call retro-hieroglyphs. This system might seem pretty confusing, by the way, but if you know what to look for, it's not too hard to understand. Now, there was one downside to using hieroglyphs, which is that some of them got to be rather elaborate and would take a long time to draw out. Luckily, the Egyptians came up with a good solution for that. This solution, which appeared around the same time as hieroglyphs, was a cursive script known as hieratic. Hieratic is another Greek word, this time brought to us by the 2nd century scholar Clement of Alexandria, meaning priestly writing, and it was a simplified form of hieroglyphs that could be easily used to write out ideas on things like papyrus and ceramics. And what was nice about hieratic is that the words were constantly written from right to left, so you didn't have to puzzle out which side of a text to start on. At any rate, this fancy cursive was used for thousands of years, and yes, Hatshepsut herself would have been very familiar with it. But then starting in the 7th century BCE, a new script came along called Demotic. Yep, that's Greek too, and according to Herodotus, it means writing of the people, which is appropriate because it really did represent the everyday language of the Egyptians, who didn't call their script Demotic, they called it the very practical Sekhshat, writing for documents. But why did Demotic replace hieratic? I mean, what was wrong with hieratic? Well, according to one possible theory I came across, it was very out of date. Apparently, it represented words and signs going all the way back to the Middle Kingdom. So while Hatshepsut could understand what was being written just fine, people living 1,000 years later, not so much. It would be like if we were writing things in 2025 in Shakespearean prose or even the language of Chaucer. In other words, over time, it would become harder and harder to understand. So it's possible that Demotic simply represented a more authentic and up-to-date writing system. And it wasn't just easier for the locals to read, it was easier for occupiers to understand as well. You see, starting in the 7th century BCE, Egypt was under the control of various foreign powers. First it was the Libyans, then the Persians, then the Greeks, and then the Romans. And so writing official documents in the current vernacular instead of ye olde Egyptian script made a lot more sense. And that's why Demotic became so popular. But starting in late antiquity, it too gave way to a new writing system known as Coptic. Why? Well, because Alexander the Great, that's why. After Alexander the Great conquered the Persian Empire and gained control of Egypt in the 4th century BCE, the Greek language and culture started to flood into Egypt. Then after Alexander died and his general Ptolemy founded a new line of pharaonic rulers, all of them Macedonian Greeks, it was common for administrative documents to be written in Greek, although the Greeks didn't entirely object to legal documents being written in the native language. However, when the Romans took over Egypt around 30 BCE, they pretty much insisted that official documents be written in Greek, which was sort of the standard lingua franca of the Mediterranean at the time. This further isolated people from their native writing system, which some scholars argue led to a sort of agraphia, a lack of a proper writing system among the people of Egypt who were forced to use the Greek language when drawing up any type of significant document. In other words, Demotic was now regulated mostly to either private correspondence, religious texts, or mixed with Greek to write down magic spells like in the Greek magical papyri, which I've covered in my History and Games episode on the Greek goddess Hecate. At any rate, Greek was so dominant in Egypt that when Christianity began to take off in Egypt around the 3rd century CE, early church fathers decided to use the Greek alphabet and a number of Greek loanwords, plus a few Demotic symbols to stand in for sounds not found in Greek, to write out the Bible in native Egyptian. And why not? After all, it was indeed the administrative language of Egypt, and also it was in no way associated with the pagan scriptures of old, namely hieroglyphs, hieratic, and demotic, which church leaders like Saint Shenouda were deeply suspicious of. Unfortunately, the suspicion of pagan texts and religion within Christianity became more and more common, and starting in the 4th century CE, Eastern Roman emperors like Theodorus I ordered native Egyptian temples to be closed, which hastened the death of Demotic, hieratic, and hieroglyphs. The last known datable inscription in native Demotic is a 452 CE graffito from the Temple of Isis at Philae. Thus, Coptic became the dominant writing system and was reflected in the spoken language as well, which thanks to Coptic writings we know had several dialects. But alas, this last stage of ancient Egyptian wouldn't last very long, and that is because of the Arab conquest, which took place in the 7th century. Unsurprisingly, these new Muslim rulers began to insist that Arabic, not Greek, be the language of the land, and Islam be the official religion. As Islam spread throughout Egypt, the Coptic Church was diminished to more of a minority religion, though not an insignificant one. And in an ironic twist, like their pagan counterparts, it would be the priests of the Coptic Church who kept their native language and writing system alive throughout the centuries, and they've managed to do so all the way up until this very day. Now notice I haven't given any examples of what ancient Egyptian actually sounded like, or how exactly to read it. And that's because scholars are still debating the particulars. So for example, Middle Egyptian, which Hatshepsut would have been one of the last to speak, had a very complicated verbal system. And that's not all. One of the biggest issues with the ancient Egyptian language is nobody really knows the exact pronunciation because the ancient Egyptian script almost never used vowels. Now you might be thinking, why did the Egyptians leave out vowels? Don't you need those to understand a word? Like, if you just write the letters BT in English, what does that mean? Is that word supposed to be bat, bet, bit, boat, boot, butt? How can you tell? Well, in a lot of Indo-European languages, it's hard to tell without a lot of context, but ancient Egyptians didn't have that problem, at least maybe not as acutely. And that's because it's part of the Afro-Asiatic language family, which isn't quite as hyper-dependent on vowels as Indo-European languages, or so I'm assuming. Although I should note that there are some vowelish hieroglyphs that exist in ancient Egyptian, but well, that's complicated and too above my pay grade to explain here. At any rate, ancient Egyptians would have seen the hieroglyphs for Hatshepsut's name and known how to pronounce them. But we in the modern age are not so sure, so for now, the A, E, and U in her name are kind of placeholders. But here's the good news. We may not know how to pronounce her name, but we do know exactly what Hatshepsut did during her lifetime thanks to the hieroglyphs found in her famous mortuary temple. These hieroglyphs tell us that Hatshepsut may have engaged in a war or two, but for the most part, she was prolific at trade and diplomacy. And knowing that the historical Hatshepsut was good at trade, I spent my time in the modern age of Civ VII focused a lot on opening trade routes and maintaining amicable relations with my neighbors, just like she did. Although, just like Hatshepsut, I did briefly get tangled up in some fighting between a couple of other civs just to see what would happen, but honestly that only lasted for a few rounds before I became friends with everybody once again. Unfortunately, this not only made for a kind of boring conclusion to my campaign. I mean, seriously, outside of the occasional natural disaster, very little happened to Hatshepsut and her people. I kind of completely forgot that I was supposed to be going for a cultural victory, not an economic one, because that's what happens when you play the game sporadically over a 2-month period and ignore your in-game advisor. So it's not surprising that I ended up losing the entire campaign because I didn't have the right victory conditions. And that is entirely on me and not the game, which is why I refuse to review Civ VII formally until I've properly completed at least 1 or 2 more campaigns. But for this initial round, I really just wanted to get a feel for the mechanics, the pacing, and all the new features. Next time round, I'll definitely be more successful. At any rate, I didn't win my first time playing Civ VII, but I did manage to maintain peaceful, prosperous relations with other countries under the auspices of the Mughal Empire, whose rulers, had they wandered the southern parts of Egypt in the early modern age, might have heard the native Egyptian language still being spoken amongst the rural population, which I think is really cool. Now, could Hatshepsut have understood her people if she had, say, managed to time travel and join the Mughals on their field trip? Probably not. Hatshepsut's version of Egyptian was 2,000 years removed from the language her people were speaking in the early modern age, which is twice as long as the temporal space between modern English and the Old English used to write the story of Beowulf, which is nigh on impossible to understand if you haven't studied Old English, and I mean Old English. Still, there might have been a word or two that Hatshepsut could make out, which in a very, very abstract way links her to the modern age, which is what we were hoping for. And with that, we've arrived at the end of my first Civ VII video series. In conclusion, I enjoyed my time with Hatshepsut in Civ VII. It gave me a chance to try out a new strategy game and a chance to learn more about ancient Egypt and Egypt's connection to distant lands like India. At any rate, thanks so much for joining Hatshepsut and I on our epic adventures. Thanks so much for supporting History and Games, guys. See you later.